Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now today we're taking a look at the RX 480, the 8GB version of the card. This launched almost 10 years ago now in June 2016 I believe, and back then you could choose from the 4 or 8GB versions. Now I don't think there would have been too much of a difference back in 2016, but if you wanted to save a bit of money, 40, 50 pounds or dollars, then the 4GB one wouldn't have been a bad choice at all if you were on a budget. These days, I definitely recommend going for the 8GB card, double the VRAM for what is essentially not much, if any, extra money in some markets, and you're going to have a much better time in the latest and greatest titles. Here in the UK, I've seen 4 and 8GB versions of this card go for between 50 and 60 pounds. The version I have here is a sapphire reference design card. Really like the look of this card, the blower style fan, a single 6-pin connector here, and it's a pretty decent size as well, quite small and compact, so you should be able to fit it in those smaller micro ATX cases. It is going to run a little warmer and a little louder than aftermarket designs, of course. But to me, when I think of a 480, this is exactly the design that I think of. So let's get into it, see what it's still capable of, and talk about any performance problems that we may encounter, because, spoiler alert, there were a couple. We'll actually start there, and to do that we need to talk about Arc Raiders. Now with the latest driver version, which is 26.1.1 at the time of this upload, the game would crash pretty much every time. We may get about 30 seconds of playtime. In order to get this to work then, I actually had to downgrade the driver version to 25.8.1. You can find previous versions on the official AMD download page, and once I had done that, the game ran absolutely fine. I was actually using the medium preset here with FSR3 set to quality. Now it's up to you what you want to do, whether you want to go with a higher preset and enable a more intensive form of FSR, or you could just turn the settings down to low, try and run at native, and I think you'd have a very similar experience. We're running pretty close to 60 FPS here. Now back in 2016 this would have been a great 1080p 60 FPS mainstream GPU, and a pretty well priced one at that, and these days it's nice to see that we can still hit 60 FPS or close to it in even the latest titles here. But will this continue as we move on, and if not, what sort of visual sacrifices will we have to make? I want to talk about another piece of not so great news now, and this is Baldur's Gate 3 at 1080p running with DX11 mode. Now this is going to run a lot worse than Vulkan, at least on paper, and in my experience Vulkan seems to deliver a smoother experience on pretty much every piece of hardware that I've tested when it comes to this game. Unfortunately, no matter the driver version, the RX 480 just crashed with Vulkan. It may, again, like Arc Raiders, run for 30 seconds or a minute, but it pretty much crashed every time, and so we had to use DX11 here in order to actually play the game for longer periods of time. We still saw at least 60 frames per second with the low preset, and FSR 2.2 set to ultra quality, so we're not losing much in terms of the visual fidelity here, but we are suffering a little bit in terms of the gameplay consistency. Nonetheless, it still runs pretty well overall. Now from this point on we experienced no more issues, be it with driver problems or in-game crashes. So Battlefield 6 here with the low preset and FSR quality gave us a very nice 66 frames per second with a 1% low of 56 and a 0.1% low of 53. This was a very consistent result for the RX 480, and I think thanks to the extra 4 gigs of VRAM this is running very smoothly. I think the 4 gig card would still do okay, but we may have to keep more of an eye on those visual settings, and we may suffer in terms of how smooth the games actually run, because pretty much every game I've tested today will use more than 4 gigs of GDDR5. In Cyberpunk 2077 we are using the low preset once again, only this time I set the textures to high and the crowds to medium. I've paired this RX GPU with an i5-12400F, of course, a modest yet very capable CPU even in 2026, and one that will pair nicely with a card like this and allow it to reach its maximum potential. As we can see here, 100% utilization in Cyberpunk with the low preset high textures and medium crowds for 59 FPS. That was slightly annoying, but we could of course enable FSR if we wanted to in order to push over that 60 FPS threshold. There will still be moments whereby we see at least 60 frames per second with this card in Cyberpunk, and when it comes to the percentile lows, the gameplay was pretty smooth. We're seeing 49 as that 1% low and 44 as that 0.1% figure. Forza Horizon 5 with the high preset and TAA for 74 frames per second with a 1% low of 64 and a 0.1% low of 61. This one ran absolutely fine, no complaints from me here, whether we are in a race with other competitors or just exploring the Mexican countryside. No performance problems whatsoever to report. Now when it comes to Grand Theft Auto 5, we can either use the enhanced or legacy version of the game, even without the ray tracing options, which we cannot of course utilise with the RX 480 here. I think this version does look better. It will perform worse, of course, it's certainly more system intensive, but we were able to use the high preset with TAA for 84 FPS, a 1% low of 72, and a 0.1% low of 68. So again, a very smooth and consistent experience with this near 10-year-old RX card. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 up next. We're using the low preset here. Again, I actually switched the textures to high, just like I did in Cyberpunk, because we have that extra headroom when it comes to the VRAM here. FSR 3.1 was also enabled and set to quality mode, so not sacrificing much in terms of visual sharpness. This gave us 65 FPS with a 1% low of 55 and a 0.1% low of 27. There was the occasional sort of micro stutter as we played here. Nonetheless, it was still a very smooth experience, but for the most part. And the game still looks pretty decent with the majority of the settings set to their lowest. Marvel Rivals next with the low preset and SSR and SSGI turned off along with FSR 3 quality. Now this gave us 62 FPS overall, but there were a few dips and drops here and there, and a lot of the time you will experience a sub 60 FPS gameplay experience. We saw 47 as the 1% low and a 0.1% low of 17, which basically backs up what I was saying, that the experience isn't going to be consistently smooth, but even so, this was a better result than I initially anticipated when going into Marvel Rivals today. Now for Red Dead Redemption 2, I've had to switch to the external recording solution here, basically my iPhone on a tripod, because whenever I enabled recording for this one, I recorded all the other games internally today. This one just dropped like 20 FPS with Radeon Relive for whatever reason, and that didn't really give us an accurate representation of what was going on. We're using the Xbox One X equivalent settings as stated by Digital Foundry years ago. It looks pretty good. To be honest, the textures are set to ultra and everything else, it's basically a mix of options. We saw 56 frames per second, 1% low of 43 and a 0.1% low of 34. I've never been fussed about 60 FPS in Red Dead Redemption 2, probably because I used to play it on PlayStation 4 back in the day, but you could certainly drop a few things in order to try and break past that threshold if you wanted to. I tried the newly released Resident Evil Requiem next. This is basically the opening section of the game, which is going to be more demanding than a lot of the indoor areas, but even so, with the lowest preset we saw 87 frames per second. This is with FSR 3 balanced enabled however, and I'd certainly recommend enabling FSR if you want a plus 60 FPS experience a lot of the time. That being said, the game was very consistent here. 87 FPS is the average with a 1% low of 78 and a 0.1% low of 71. And the performance is only going to pick up as we make our way into those more corridor-like indoor sections of this title. I think even at low, the game looks pretty good, to be honest, and nice to see it running on what some would consider this ancient RX card. Let's finalise then with CS2 at 1080p with a high preset. MSAA was off here. It will switch on by default, but I just turned it off in order to try and gain a few more frames. And yeah, not much to report. Pretty much a solid experience with a few little stutters every so often as represented by that 0.1% low, but perhaps you could do with turning the visuals down a little bit in order to avoid this. I think we just may be encroaching on that VRAM limitation a little bit here, but aside from that, in terms of actual performance, yeah, it was a pretty good time. But not bad for a 10-year-old card, eh? And if you're trying to decide between this and, say, a 1060, a card that did once offer fierce competition for this top-end RX series back in the day, well, it may just be the extra VRAM that swings that decision for you these days. Thanks as always for watching, and hopefully I'll see you all in the next one.